Hello, everyone, and welcome to Historia Canadiana, the show about Canadian culture and the way it informs this nation's history. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my co-host, whose humor is lofty, his discourse peremptory, his tongue filed, his eye ambitious, his gait majestical, and his general behavior vain. Mackenzie.
And my name is Mackenzie, here with my co-host. He likes drinking pina coladas and getting caught in the rain. Here is the hostess with the mostess, Patrick.
That is indeed moi. Happy to be here. How are you?
I'm doing great. Living with COVID lifestyle and school now. It's great. It's all fine.
And you know, nothing sums up COVID lifestyle like pina coladas
and getting caught in
the rain.
I wish I could get caught in the rain. I wish I could leave my apartment and get caught in the rain. I wish I could use my majestic gait.
So today we're going to be talking basically what is part 3 of the rebellions in the Canadas.
Woohoo!
It's the final part, and we wanted to focus on what we're going to refer to as the radical elements. Since, as listeners probably noticed in the past 2 episodes, the discussion mostly centered around both Mackenzie and Papineau being rather moderate for most of their political history.
I got confused for a second when you said Mackenzie at the very...
We're never going to get over it. Every time we're going to mention someone named Mackenzie on the show, it's going to be confusing.
We're going to get to World War II and it's going to be a shit show.
Oh, for sure. Prime Minister Mackenzie. Wait, I was Prime Minister? Yes.
God. Continue.
Sorry. So as listeners probably noticed, Mackenzie and Papineau were rather moderate, but in most rebellions and revolutions and uprisings, resistances, whatever you want to call them, there was this more radical element that kind of helped push certain things forward more than being a moderate ever could, probably. And that's what we're going to focus on today. But before that, we actually want to go back a bit to episode 20. And there's a very specific reason for this. It's because we got a certain email from a listener called Patrice. I won't give his full name, but I think it's important to address it because he brings up some interesting comments about the way we did the show and presented the rebellion in Lower Canada. And given that they were actually quite important comments, I think it would be important to address them now just to make sure that everyone's on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not going to read the full email or basically going to sum it up. But Patrice's point was that we came off in episode 20, in the episode about Papineau, as somewhat condescending towards the French movement in Lower Canada in 1837 and 1838, and that we were taking more of a winner's side of history stance to it. He brought up a few examples, mostly in the language that we used. For example, he mentioned something that Mackenzie said about thankfully being educated in an English school brought more nuance. A few things here and there, right? This is, again, just me summing up. And I want to clarify certain things right here. First of all, I don't think that neither of us feel rather condescension towards the French Canadians then or now.
Any condescension was purely accidental. I was more just talking to the fact that my education was very layered and we got a lot of sides of the story besides what was the base curriculum.
Exactly. Which the base curriculum is not wrong. It's just one side. That was the point of the comment, right?
Yeah.
So the whole thing, I think I answered Patrice correctly, but there was another point that, for example, kind of opens up to this discussion a bit more. For example, that we could refer to the whole movement not as a rebellion, but as a resistance. And that calling it a rebellion, for example, is indicative of how we place ourselves politically, right? That we're referencing the British point of view and they see it as treason, right? They see this movement as treason rather than from the more ground level movement as resisting and asserting one's nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
And that's certainly a fair point. I've heard the term resistance used with these movements before. It's certainly a good point to make. Personally, I chose to use rebellion because that's the common term.
Yeah, if we're using words like rebellion, it's because it is the more common language associated with this movement. You can definitely say resistance, and that's a perfectly usable term. We're just going with the common language so that we don't lose people in the confusion.
And finally, one last thing that I want to mention is that, and this is potentially a fault of our own, is this idea that sometimes we refer to things that we've covered on past episodes, right? Or without necessarily going over them in the new ones. We assume that because this show is a rather chronological narrative, that people listened before. So, for example, we did cover negatively, or more negatively, the British response and the British idea at this time through people like Halliburton in episode 17, or we covered the rise in French-Canadian nationalism rather positively in later episodes with the rise of appearances of the French novel, things like that. And sometimes listening to episodes on their own, you can lose some of that nuance. And I just want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. We don't want to be condescending. We understand the complexity of it. Sometimes that gets lost in translation.
We're not, again, it's not a malicious intent. For example, we don't bring up past episodes in depth because the podcast already comes a bit over an hour. And just so for the sake of brevity, moving along and keeping ourselves on point, because otherwise we can distract ourselves pretty easily. We like to cut out certain bits so we don't have to repeat ourselves. Because if we talk about how the British screwed over people, we're going to be here for many days.
Oh, for sure. We could have a whole podcast based off of how the British screwed over everyone.
And just like this, we're already distracting each other. So you can see where the problems arise.
So anyway, that again was a brief overview of Petrus's comments. And if anyone else has any comments or questions or concerns about how we approached certain subjects, feel free. Honestly, I'm more than happy to get them and to answer them.
Same, email through the Facebook page. Add us on Twitter if you feel like it. Do we have a Twitter account?
Yes, we do.
Add us on Twitter. Twitter's always a great place. Twitter's a great, healthy place to discuss things on the internet, as we all know. I'm more than willing to learn. I'm more than willing to admit I did something wrong or I said something stupid, and I'm more than happy to learn what can be done to be better.
Certainly.
Let's go move on to the show.
All right. So within the purpose of contextualizing this show, I think we should exactly start off with just reminding people where we're at in history for a brief minute, and then going on to those radical movements and where they emerge. So for people who might not have remembered, we left off with a discussion on the Upper and Lower Canadian Rebellion or Resistance in 1837 and 1838. And there are two major groups that emerge from this. There are the Upper Canadian rebels, represented by Mackenzie, and we have the Parti Patriote, or the Patriots, as most commonly represented by Louis-Joseph Papineau. And their rhetoric for most of their existence, really, most of their time in this early stage of the rebellion resistance, is relatively moderate, right? They're aware of certain limitations in their capacity to affect change. They want change in Upper and Lower Canada, mostly in relation to wanting better representation for the people. They demand various things in relation to tithes and taxes. But it's far from being two groups that actively demand violence towards the British. Right?
For sure. Papineau, again, was seigneurial, and that's something where he differs from the radical movement, where the more moderates were willing to still work with the seigneurial system that was in place. Meanwhile, the radicals were, as we'll get into later, were in favor of dismantling it.
And obviously, there were some changes as this would go along. Papineau himself would get increasingly quote-unquote radicalized, but even then, even at his peak, I would say, it wasn't exactly what we're going to cover today.
Because we're still not sure if he even wanted to do it.
Exactly. It's still a historical debate as to whether or not he was actively proposing taking up arms against the British. And ultimately, I don't think it's a question that matters that much.
No.
In the sense that history has kind of identified him as generally being this middle ground, this charismatic leader. And regardless of his nuances, I think it's very hard to dissociate people from that idea, no matter how much research will go into it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that that research isn't important, it's just very hard to dissociate it from him or Mackenzie. One of the things that truly did push certain radical elements was most certainly the British response. And this association by the British with the whole of the Patriote movement with radical ideas, right? They essentially put Upper and Lower Canada, especially Lower Canada, under martial law at the end of 1837,
Mm-hmm.
and ostensibly took over complete political and social control of those provinces.
It's a common theme throughout history. When things get extreme, radicals come to power. It's a extreme, what is it? Extreme begets extreme, I think is something close to how the saying goes.
Yeah, pretty much. And so because of a violent reaction by the British, or a more extreme reaction, it certainly didn't help the cause of the moderates, or at least the less radical people within the Patriote or Mackenzie parties.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, I think that recap was pretty succinct. We can move on to the main point, which is looking at these fringes. So, much like many of the radical movements in history, they start out as a pretty vocal minority. Not all, obviously, this is a generalization, but for this sake, actually, it was actually starting off as a vocal minority within the Patriote Party. And if you want to look into it more, there were some like Cyril Hector Octave Côté, Édouard Étienne Rodier, and Amaury Giraud, who were members of the Patriote Party, but, initial supporters of these more violent reactions towards the British actually taking up arms, probably not really understanding just how limited their resources were facing the British, or even if they did, not really caring.
It's the time of revolution, at that point they thought they could. You see a couple of, again, the big ones that even the Patriots bring up in their address to the Sons of Liberty as the American Revolution, the French Revolution. There's this sort of idea of, even if you don't have the resources, others will flock to you and give you the resources that you need, because it's the popular thing to do.
It's the popular thing to do, and you're kind of hoping that you get enough people on your side, regardless of the inherent violence of what you're proposing, that your initial lack of resources will be compensated for.
Yeah, it's not, again, however we frame it, it's not that we're saying radicalism is inherently a negative thing. These were radical elements. And they were going with what had worked in most recent years.
So by 1836, so basically on the eve of the revolution, the radicals actually outnumbered the more moderate elements like Papineau.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't really, not that it didn't change the dynamic of the party. It certainly helped push certain aspects forward. It certainly helped instigate certain actions by the Patriote Party. But Papineau was still seen as this charismatic leader. He was still seen as this person that was at the head of it, despite being outnumbered ideologically.
And also, again, this is lending credence to something we discussed in the last episode about Papineau, him being forced into a position of taking, again, radical ideas and being forced into this Patriot Party. If he's outnumbered, there's a good chance he's following the wave, and he's the best person to lead them.
He's the best person to lead them, and he's not above criticizing members of his own party. We'll get into it a bit later, but there are openly known debates between him and members of his own party, or members that are associated with his party, such as the main people that we're going to talk about today, the Nelson brothers.
Mm-hmm.
And just him being very vocal and critical about not being on board with their same ideas, and yet still continuing to be this leader of the movement regardless of that.
Mhm.
I think that's as good a segue as any into the two main figures that we're going to talk about today. That is the Nelson brothers.
Woohoo!
The Nelson brothers, also known as Wilfred and his younger brother Robert, were initially part of this Patriot Party. They were initially moderates, and they kind of very quickly evolved into being more active and revolutionary members of a kind of offshoot, and eventually a straight up offshoot of the Patriot Party.
Mhm.
And I want to focus on something you said earlier that was kind of interesting when you mentioned, Mackenzie, that Papineau was an aristocrat. Right?
Yeah, you get this a lot, especially with drum roll the Nelson brothers.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, you get that indeed with the Nelson brothers, who are both ironically from British aristocratic descent.
Which is mind-boggling that they're like joining with the French Canadian Parti Patriot movement. I just butchered that pronouncement, but that's okay. We're gonna move past it.
Yeah, I guess it's mind-blowing in the sense that, right, you wouldn't think of it, but also they were born and raised there. They probably understood more than any of their British ancestors would have, including, by the way, Horatio Nelson, who fought against Napoleon in the Napoleonic Wars. But probably they understood the French-Canadian plight better than any of their British peers just because they were born and raised there, right?
Yeah, and it's also, they're still in a time where large parts of their country are going to be made of immigrants and people who are flocking to their country. So having these people be British joining up with the French Canadian movement, it's not that uncommon. It's surprising to say, but the reality is that it's not totally uncommon. Again, we're always going to be making comparisons to the American one, but a man like Lafayette, who came from France to join the American Revolution, isn't in a similar sort of situation. So shocking to say, but pretty common overall.
Oh yeah, I would say so. Says I with no real historical source to back. This is just our perceptions of it, but
Yeah.
I would agree with that. So
what you were taught is propaganda.
I'm sorry?
What you were taught is propaganda. It's all a lie.
It's all a lot. Really? Do tell. Explain to me what's not propaganda.
What's not propaganda?
Yep.
Oh God, I don't even know.
We live in a post-truth world, honestly. It's all lies. It doesn't matter.
But what did matter was their radical ideology that they were trying to bring out. They were originally reform supporters, but again, as Britain subsequently and constantly denied, rejected, and destroyed their attempts to try and attain actual reform, they moved farther to the fringes, which is understandable. The radical, violent overthrows is what's going to get attention at this point.
Yeah, it's what's going to get attention. And again, kind of coming back to what you were saying, the idea that you can get people on board when you succeed with that rather radical action. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all well and fine to talk about it, right? But to actually do something and actually promote and, be there among the people and do stuff that you wouldn't expect necessarily from politicians, to actually be a part of these movements, is a much more potent representation, or at least a much more potent message that you're sending to the British, saying that, see, even us British descendant aristocrats are willing to take up arms against you. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, as Mackenzie was pointing to, they are a bit more violent and expound a radical overthrow, basically, of the British government. And as we'll see later, they also want to attempt the establishment of a republic of Lower Canada.
Which is kind of interesting to take a look at.
Oh yeah, we're going to take a look at that a bit later, specifically through what is basically the literature of this week, their Declaration of Independence.
Which is, there's a lot that we're going to be dissecting with that bad boy.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to that pretty soon. That's honestly what's most interesting of this episode, was deconstructing that whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's another group that I want to mention, just slightly outside of who the Nelson brothers were, but that are also indicative of this increased radicalization of the Patriot Party, who are called the Fils de la Liberté. which literally translates to the Sons of Liberty.
Woohoo.
Which, if you want to make even more comparisons to the American Republic and the American Revolution, the Sons of Liberty were another paramilitary group that did actually exist during the American Revolution.
This is the definition of copying homework, but only changing it up a little bit when you hand it in.
I don't think they were hiding themselves from that.
No.
They often referenced the American system and as being more democratic, right?
And it was also probably a smart ploy on their part to see if they could get assistance from Americans if they were saying they were doing the same thing.
And
It didn't work in the end, but it was a smart play to do.
it didn't work, but they still did get some support from Americans. So in that sense, it did kind of work. They got support from more common Americans, if you will. They didn't get support from the American government, that's for sure. So the Fils de la Liberté are also a paramilitary group, and that formed itself in the summer of 1837. So if you'll think back to episode 20, that's right before the actual rebellions actually explode.
Mm-hmm.
And it's mostly composed of young people who want to be associated with the Patriote Party, but who can't officially, mostly because being part of political parties requires you to be an adult or at least of 21 years of age. So it's a way of getting these younger people into your more liberal ideas or your more reform-oriented ideas, but without having them officially be a part of your political party.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because most of the group is actually not militarized, but there is a military wing to it. And that's why I'm mentioning it here, because this is an initial way that these radical elements do kind of form up. And quick side note, by the way, and this is kind of a sizzle reel, if you will, for our eventual discussion about Confederation, is that there was a very famous lawyer, or someone who would become a very famous lawyer, who was kind of a go-between between the Sons of Liberty and the Patriote Party. And his name was Georges-Étienne Cartier, which I don't know if you know who he is, Mackenzie.
Ou Jacques Cartier?
No, Georges-Étienne Cartier.
Oh, I know his statue that sits up on Mount Royal in Montreal.
That's right. Okay. But there's a reason why he has a statue. I don't
Really?
know if that one's going to be
They don't just
either.
give those out they don't give out statues for free?
Oh, right.
Damn.
Exactly. To anyone? No, he was actually he's considered one of the fathers of Confederation.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the main politicians in what would eventually become Canada East, so Quebec. He was one of the main politicians who helped John A. Macdonald in his project of creating Confederation.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a little interesting side note. It has nothing to do with the rebellions themselves. I just thought it was an interesting tidbit. So do you actually want to tell us a bit about the documentation that survives from the Sons of Liberty, these declarations that they make among themselves as a group, and kind of gives us an idea of who they were and what they represented?
Because it's important to examine, and it's a really interesting thing. We have an address of the Sons of Liberty to Montreal, to young people of the colonies of North America, telling them to take up arms and all that. And for the most part, it's what you expect. But there's some interesting language that they use that really resonates with the values that Canada has today.
Definitely. Do you want to take over and talk a bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So just from the opening paragraph, it's a real interesting spiel where in urgent events in the affairs of a country make it necessary for citizens to form associations, the respect due to the opinions of society requires on their part an explicit declaration of the reasons which induce them to form a coalition and of the principles which they intend to establish through the organization. And that's a really interesting point. So I'm using a translated version, first of all, it was in French and translated in English. But to me, that's a really interesting take on you cannot simply rebel. There is a duty of anybody who wants to form these groups and societies to give reason why. There's a duty to list the reasons and list what they will be doing to improve. And I think that's an interesting way to open up their discussion of what is, not something that's usually associated with radical movements.
No, not at all. And yeah, it comes off as a privilege, right? It's something that you have to, it's not a right, it's a privilege. It's something that you have to uphold and you have to earn almost. There is an element of going to get it and proving yourself that you are worthy of it, but it is indeed not something that you should necessarily fight for, all right? Or you know, kill someone for.
No. And speaking of rights, the other opening paragraphs make a big deal of discussion on the right of association. And this is where you get a very strong Canadian sentiment of the right of association is they're equating as being just as important as one's personal liberties, which is kind of crazy to say, but it's a very Canadian sentiment to have, where we take great pride in our ability to cooperate in Canada. Again, being sort of seen as this socialist country in North America versus the more conservative states below us, where they are all about personal liberties. You have these radical people declaring for the Republic that their right to associate is just as important as any personal liberties. And that is the duty of the government to follow their rights to associate. Because the government is in many ways just one large right to associate.
I do find that interesting that while they so clearly model themselves after so much in the United States, that this is where it would start to diverge, or at least this is one of the clear divergences. I don't think we've ever examined that specifically, but I would be interested to maybe see why that kind of has formed, that idea has formed specifically here rather than in the States, right? Or what changed between 1775 and 1836 that those ideas would seem more reasonable to what is, again, ostensibly radical elements of that same party.
And going on again, the beginning is where a lot of the stuff happens. I'll get into a breakdown of the lower stuff, but also just by taking this title of Sons of Liberty, the Association of Young People of Montreal has no intention of turning into a private cabal, et cetera, et cetera. That's a very big thing to do, to declare yourself and say, we are not an underground movement. We are not going to be fighting underground. It's going to be, we are here to take part almost. Again, violently so, but they are making it clear their intention of, we are not special underground organization that is only free for private people to join. This is something that anybody can come and join. Again, playing into this document is overall a pretty solid address, I would say. Just from what I've read of it, they emphasize their youth, which is a smart thing to do. They call for Canada. They almost don't even seem angry at Britain. There's this constant wave of just disappointment with the mother country, which is a really smart thing to do.
Yes.
And what was also really smart is the design of this document. When they list the offenses of how Britain has failed them and disappointed them, they write them out in paragraphs, long paragraphs.
Yeah.
And it sort of gives, like, there's big reasons why Britain failed them. And then when they list their own changes, their points of declaration of why they're doing this, it's very small. It's bullet points. It's almost as saying, we don't want much. We don't want these huge changes. You've just failed us so much, though. It's a very smart way to put it. And it makes it very easy to understand and read what they want to change, while also making people shy away from, you just sort of take for granted that these British had all these massive failures without maybe fully reading through the text.
Definitely. And it also shows the eloquence of the movement itself. It shows that they're actually thinking this through, and they're saying, we can actually have a reasonable discussion about this, or we can actually have like a head on our shoulders and tell you very specifically and clearly what you're doing wrong.
And then again, it's not some rage fest. The document very clearly makes their point of, we tried reform, we tried working with the British government, but they have constantly made empty, hollow promises. And they bring up specific points too. Again, like the War of 1812, there was supposed to be change after that. That didn't come through. Just these constant lists of barrage of how Britain has made hollow promises. And it's a very smart way to play it.
And I think one of the reasons why they can actually afford to be like that is because this is one wing where it's more associated with the moderate patriote. And again, the Fils de la Liberté have a paramilitary wing, certainly, but it's a very small part of it, and they've never actively attacked things. So I think a big part of them, especially for young people who want to show themselves as being able to be a part of this political movement and show that they have, again, ideas of their own, I think is more important to show a more moderate stance.
Mm-hmm.
But, and this is where I think we'll get more into the radical element of this group, is that in October, there is actually an armed conflict between the Fils de la Liberté and what is basically their complete opposite in every single way, in what is called the Doric Club, which is a private, British, and conservative club that is completely loyal to the British Crown. It's diametrically opposed to everything that the Fils de la Liberté represent and everything that the Patriots represent.
Mm-hmm.
And they straight up had an armed conflict in the streets of Montreal. And this is one of the reasons why the British government actually sent out arrest warrants for a lot of the Patriot leadership. It was one of the ways that they said, okay, well, look, they're literally running amok in the street and shooting, a perfectly legal private club just because they disagree with them. And it was one step that led the British to react against them.
As the British do.
And again, it's like anything, you want peace within your nation, you want peace within your state, but again, and as we see constantly, this is just a complete misunderstanding of what they actually represent and what they actually want, and the reaction that is reacting to something that they don't understand or don't want to understand.
From a certain perspective, they see these patriots, this parti patriote is evil.
Oh, yeah.
But that's not entirely true. The things get framed, and again, propaganda is a big tool that's starting to come out. Again, the address was a strong piece of patriot propaganda, very well done piece, but it was still propaganda. And then this is this sort of refiring that leads to the Doric Club and the British Empire doing what the British Empire does. And they just sort of get these very mixed perspectives of what is evil going on.
Yeah, exactly. And quick note, people tend to associate the word propaganda with something entirely negative. But just to clarify, I think you mean it in the sense of it's a political message, right? Which is the basic definition of propaganda. But it's just, I feel that this caveat is necessary just because the word has such a negative connotation to it now.
And it's such a broad encompassing of what people call propaganda as well. And you're right, there is a strong I'm not saying propaganda is bad or good or bad. Propaganda is a tool.
Exactly.
Like anything else.
Yeah. So right around this time, after the Doric conflict club and the increased British reaction and the kind of mounting of tensions, there is in October of 1837, so not long after this conflict, there is what's called the Rencontre des Six Comtés, or basically the six-county meeting, which is one of the biggest patriote reunions in their history. And it's one that happens just before major conflicts break out. As we mentioned in the last episode, the Saint-Denis conflict, the Saint-Charles conflict, the Saint-Eustache conflict, just before that. And we have a mix here of radical elements, moderate elements. Papineau is there, Wilfred Nelson is there. And what is, I think the estimates are like 700 or 800 people are there. It's quite a big regrouping of people. And I noted a particular passage between a dialogue between Papineau and Nelson that I think really sums up both their opinions. It's in French, but I can translate it off the cusp. So basically it says, according to Papineau, quote, "The best way to fight the English or to fight England is to not buy anything from her, right? To use weapons, no, not that." And apparently Nelson immediately responded with, "Well, I completely disagree with Mr. Papineau. I think it's well enough time to melt down our spoons and our plates that are made of tin and use it to make bullets."
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Straight savage right there. An ice cold take from Wilfred Nelson. But as I said, I think it's very indicative of the two conflicting opinions at this time. Because on the one hand, you have Papineau, who, again, right before shit goes down, he's saying, no, just use economic pressure, use social pressure to show the British your discontent. Just don't buy stuff from them, right? Buy from anywhere else. Buy from your local butcher. I don't care. Just don't buy from the British.
But that's a nice sentiment, but it's also kind of unrealistic at this point. The British just... So I can see where Nelson is coming from.
Definitely.
It's hard to buy non-British like that, especially in the triangle system of trade. Again, where the mother country is so prevalent, everything that you're going to be buying in your manufactured goods is most probably going to be from Britain. So I can understand Nelson's dilemma of saying, no, we're like, that's not entirely the way to go.
I also understand Papineau's sentiment in that there's been a history in Canada of the British really favoring British merchants, deliberately putting laws into place that favor them.
Mm-hmm.
They did that after they took over, obviously. They did it after the War of 1812, 1815. They did it at all kinds of moments that really deliberately favor British merchants and English products rather than let the so-called free market do its job, as many were claiming at the time. It's kind of a very false hypocrisy, and I think that's mostly what Papineau is referring to. But I also understand, like you, that at some point, someone like Nelson was inevitably going to rise up and say, look, it's all well and fine to say that, but it's just not going to work. And I think his quote also really sums up well this idea of resources, where he says we need to use our plates and our spoons that are made of tin. Our tin plates are tin spoons. So we're using everything at our disposal. Like we're calling upon the people to send in things that are ostensibly necessary to their survival, right? You need something to eat with to really fight the British, right? There's a question of priorities here that Wilfred Nelson really puts it above everything else. And I think that's really quite striking. It's a striking image in my mind. And it's after that moment that, once again, we'll kind of get to where we were talking about in episode 19 and episode 20, but we're going to look at it from a different perspective. So as we recall, the British called for the arrest of the main leaders in the Patriote Party, including Wilfred Nelson, including Louis-Joseph Papineau, and put great bounties on their head. It was something like $500 or $1,000, which at the time was massive for anyone who brought in these people. And later they would do the same thing with Mackenzie once he started in Upper Canada in December of that year. And as we recall, this is definitely this call to capture is definitely what instigated a lot of the violent reactions, most notably, as recalled, the Battle of Saint-Denis, which is exactly as it sounds. It's a battle between the Patriotes and the British at a place called Saint-Denis. It's not the most original name, but it works.
And that's most battles. Isn't it the one battle that the rebellion won, sort of?
That's exactly. As we'll see a bit later, there were other conflicts, but they're not kind of considered canon as part of the rebellions, right? Because at that point, not only was it in the end of 1838, when most of it had died down, but then we're really talking fringe groups. We're not really talking anymore about official Patriot Party people. We're really on the fringes of the fringes at that point. So in what is considered the official canon of the main battles that took place between the Patriotes and the British, this is the only one that they won. And where we can relate this back to Wilfred Nelson is that he was at the head of the Patriot militia that had formed to fight the British at that battle. His brother, Robert, who will become a more important player later on in this story, was not at the battle, but once the battle was over and the leaders escaped, including Papineau, including Wilfred Nelson, Robert Nelson would also be arrested because of his association with his brother, even though for all intents and purposes he had nothing to do with that rebellion and didn't actually want to do anything with it. But yeah, we're not going to cover the battle again because we've pretty much covered it in episode 20. The Patriotes and the British fight, and even though the Patriots actually win that battle, many of the leadership still flee to the US.
Yeah, it was a very hollow victory.
It it was great for, again, their own messages, their own propaganda, but the clock was ticking, right? A lot of this victory was because it was a very spur of the moment thing. Not, I think the Patriotes had a better turnaround time. They were able to get their men together very quickly and spring on the British, or at least attack much more efficiently than the British could in what is essentially guerrilla warfare, which the British were not used to doing.
No.
But once the British got their act together, basically, and you see it with the Battle of Saint-Charles and the Battle of Saint-Eustache, it was
a done foregone conclusion.
But, and this is, I think, where you'll be able to jump back on a bit more. From the United States, where both Robert and Wilfrid would flee to, and Pepino, as we've mentioned, so basically everyone who's someone in the Patriot Party lines would flee to the States. They would organize very quickly in little groups and fringes to be able to re-enter Lower Canada and Upper Canada and basically try to reestablish an independent republic of Upper and Lower Canada, respectively. And there would be a first one at the beginning of 1838, a first attempt to enter in to Lower Canada from Lake Champlain. And it was done in February. So again, end of winter right here. Not great, but still an attempt. And one that gets pretty far, right? Apparently there's like 500 people. They have about 250 weapons that they stole from the British.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's actually like they have a lot of stuff going on with them. And this one is actually specifically led by Robert Nelson. And it is also during this brief invasion that Patriot will read out what was ostensibly their Declaration of Independence of Lower Canada. That was written by Robert Nelson himself.
And it is a doozy.
Okay, please enlighten us, Mackenzie. How is it a doozy?
So it's actually pretty interesting because a lot of their sort of tenets that they highlight, they reflect some pretty modern Canadian values, which I find is really interesting because this was just a small radical rebellion, but you see how important this was to play out in the future of Canada. But before we get into that, we'll get into their opening spiel about their constant target. They have a very specific target, King George III.
Who was no longer king by then. He was actually the king during the American Revolution. And I think that's a very interesting choice to specifically target him when talking about the British.
Again, they use the British government, but the main target is King George III. They refer to him as the he. A lot of the time, he did this. He despised, closed its ears to our address, requests, protests, and remonstrations against its unconstitutional, unjust intervention in our affairs. He disposed of our income without constitutional consent. Moving on, though, and you get to, they actually have, because in the American Declaration of Independence, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are the big three words and takeaways, yeah?
Yep.
In this one, we have liberty, civil, and religious, which I think is a very interesting juxtaposition to the American independence. This focus. So? Well, religious is the big one because they say that they are rebelling under divine providence. But then later they also say they are going to make a secular government, separation of church and state so that people may pursue religion freely. That's a very knotted, convoluted way of going about things. Using God as the reason why you are allowed to rebel, but then also saying we're not going to be a religious. God is not something that we're concerned with. But then using religion as one of your three main tenets that you're trying. And it speaks to the complicated history that the area of Lower Canada and eventually Quebec has with religion. There's a very long, very complicated history there.
I don't know if it's necessarily contradictory in the sense that they still said that just because there was a separation of church and state does not mean that the church was not important.
No,
right?
Obviously not.
So
I just find it very interesting that they use this divine providence as their sort of go-to. And then they also have religious freedom as the fourth part of their declaration, their Fourth Amendment, I guess it would be. The Fourth Amendment is that all union between church and state be declared abolished, and everyone has the right to freely exercise the religion and belief that his conscience dictates.
Do you think it's maybe also a rhetorical tool?
Oh, for sure.
To get as many people on board as possible, kind of even though they are the radical element, the fringe group, to get as many people on their side as possible, say, no, we're not disavowing that God exists at all. We're just saying that once this republic is declared, you'll be able to practice your own religion, right? You'll be able to be Catholic, Anglican, whatever you please.
And I think that's the other main. You say, again, Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant, they're all still sects of Christianity. And I think that was the main takeaway from this, is that God and Christianity still exists, and that's still the religion we're going to be able to go to. But you're allowed to be whatever form, variation, flavor of Christianity you want. Which is, instead of looking, again, like the modern perspective would be they're of the multiple religions, but that's not the case back then. They just have Christianity in different flavors.
Or at least it's the ones that they focus on.
Yeah, exactly. And you speak to bringing in as many people as they could. You definitely see that with some of these. Some of these are very strange amendments to have. Just like the imprisonment of debt will no longer exist except in the case of obvious fraud, which will be specified in an act of legislature of Lower Canada to this effect. That's such a strange thing for me to put in your major declaration of saying, we're not going to imprison you over debt anymore. Same with saying mortgage on property must be special for it to exist. If you take up arms, all your debt will be erased. There's a very monetary component that they're really trying to use to take the people in.
And I think one of the major things that we have to take into consideration here is a lot of the French Canadians that they were trying to get on board were poor, or poorer, right? They weren't all Papineau and Nelsons who had an aristocratic backing. A lot of them were subject to the British economy, to British landlords, to British monetary systems. And to have this piece of paper that says you won't have to be subjected to what is ostensibly the tyranny of the dollar anymore is huge.
I'm sure it was a popular thing to put in. It's just very interesting how specific they are when they took it. But the one I find very interesting is even back in 1838, they made a big decree for public education.
Okay, yeah. Go on with that.
Well, because it's the 13th one. That as a necessity and a duty of the government toward the people, public education in general will be brought into operation and encouraged in a special way as soon as circumstances permit. So obviously there's some caveats there. But there's a very interesting way that public education is so important to them, which you do have reflected in modern Canada. Modern Canada is a very strong education powerhouse in the world. I want to make sure I said this right, so I checked with some articles, and it's up there now with what most people consider to be the educational powerhouses, like the Nordic countries and the countries such as Singapore and South Korea. Canada is up there in the ranking with those countries. And I think that's a very special thing that's going on in this document that was just about rebellion, that they put this in here. This is a common collective goal.
Yeah, I know that the debate about public education is one that goes quite far back in Canada, right? It goes back to the 19th century, but I really like the point that while they're starting fresh, we're going to do it right this time. Like we're going to make sure that this happens. More debating about it. It's just something that should be in Canada, or in Lower Canada at least. And we're going to make sure that it's fundamental to our own charter.
Same with again, this is again a funny one for Papineau, is that the feudal or seigneurial tenure is in fact abolished as if it had never existed in this country. That was not a Joseph Papineau decree, that's for sure.
No, exactly. I don't know how much, I should have looked into it and I didn't, how much he was involved, or at least if he reacted to this declaration.
Again, I just find it really interesting. Like again, going back up, if you take up arms, your debt will be erased. I gotta wonder how long they would have had that in effect. If that actually happened, the workability of that, just in modern day Canada, can you imagine all of your university debt is erased when you take up arms?
Look, I'd say we'd have a pretty militaristic society if that was the case.
Which was probably the point. That was probably the point.
Probably, yeah.
But they still made free public education. It's a very interesting. The last one I want to bring up is one of the last ones about the Crown lands and how they will take the Crown lands from England. It seems kind of interesting that they don't even just want Lower Canada anymore. They also want the British Crown lands in their independence. It seemed like because in Canada there was New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Upper and Lower Canada, And then, oh, you had that large swath of Rupert's Land, the King's Dominion, all these other places that weren't part of Upper and Lower Canada, that were just sort of these monopolized areas.
Yeah.
It was just strange. It just seemed like a strange one to include me. I don't know if it was because the land was part of a different part of Canada that wasn't technically part of Lower Canada. Because if it was part of Lower Canada, wouldn't they just get it when they got their republic?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Again, I don't have the basis. Maybe somebody will email in and tell us and inform us. It just seemed like the strangest one to me.
Or maybe they assume that the republic is going to be small, kind of like the one that Mackenzie initially set up just around the Great Lakes, which is a very small island initially.
Yeah.
So that's where I'm going. They probably just assumed that it was just a small territory and that it would progressively get bigger as either they invaded or people deliberately joined into the Republic, or the US annexed them, as they probably would have if they actually did become a republic. Because there's no way that
become a republic, become another state.
Yeah. Honestly, this is an interesting speculation. I doubt that such a small country would have ever existed between the two massive powerhouses that already were British North America and the United States. Mm-hmm. Someone would have gotten back into the other. Yeah, I don't think it would have been possible for it to such a small thing. No, I don't know. This is just me speculating, but I don't know.
Well, it's an interesting speculation to do. This entire declaration, you have to speculate on parts of it. What would it be like, for example, no mortgage, or the customary dower is gone?
It's interesting that these are still questions on people's minds now, especially in these days in the States of debt and all that, and what you owe to your landlord and so on and so forth. It's just, this is Marxism at its finest. It's just like, yeah, your debts are erased. It doesn't matter. It's fine. Just stop living under the tyranny of
monetary value
that don't advantage you.
Well, and then the other big one that's really interesting for Canada is the death penalty pronounced only in the case of murder only and not otherwise, which is a big deal back then.
That's a big deal because, as we might talk about later, someone like Wilfred Nelson, who will later have a prolonged political career, will actually go on to reform a lot of the prisons. Mm-hmm. Right. And for context for people, prison sentences very heavily relied on the death penalty for quite some time. Right? And one of the reforms was that it was exactly what they're talking about in this declaration of saying, okay, you don't have to kill that many people for everything. Right. Which is huge, as you say. It's great.
Yeah. And it's a big part of, again, Canadian culture. The death penalty was outlawed in Canada sometime in the 60s or in the 70s for the general public, and only remained in the military until 1998. And even then it was abolished from there, as opposed to, I believe there are certain states that still use the death penalty.
Yeah, I think so. I'm not up to date on American
state law,
state law, but I think so. American listeners, send in your emails telling us what it is.
Yeah. Just overall, this declaration is an interesting document of what almost was. And again, as you were speculating, the speculation is wild of what would have actually stuck if this document came into being.
I don't know. I do want to mention another thing, though. The very last point in that declaration is, I have the French version up, but we will serve the French and English languages in all public manner. We tend to, and the way that we've been talking about it, we tend to focus this as a French-Canadian thing, but they were not above being aware that there is a considerable English element in the Canadas or in British North America. And so you had to be somewhat inclusive. And I do find that it's an interesting inclusion once again, because let's face it, that's still a debate that goes on today in Canada, is the place of English and French.
I'm sure the British Nelson brothers were big parts of getting that one in.
So yeah, as we mentioned, this was basically during the first invasion, to bring it all back to our main story. But the thing with this first invasion of 1838 is that they were arrested at the border, basically. The border was a bit more flexible than what it is today, but still the Nelson brothers, or at least Robert Nelson and his troops, were stopped before they got particularly far into British North American territory.
Mhm.
And that kind of put a stop to that attempt at a utopia that they were trying to put up in the Republic of Lower Canada at that moment. One of the last things that I want to talk about that I find really cool is what's called later the Hunter Brothers. That would be the loose translation. They refer to themselves as the Frères Chasseurs.
Right.
And the Frères Chasseurs is interesting because it's kind of a secret society. And I don't mean this in an Illuminati sense. I don't mean this in like, ooh, they're controlling the world from behind the scenes. No. I mean it in the sense that you had to go through quite the channels to be a part of it. It's almost like a Masonic lodge in that sense, right? We all know it exists, but also to get into it is a whole process. And there's quite a hierarchy to this group that is formed. And it's basically the extension of that first attempt at invasion in Lower Canada through Lake Champlain, where it was an attempt at an organized and radicalized militia once the mainstream or official rebellion kind of falters. Again, from the US and with the help of many Americans, people like Robert Nelson, and I mentioned him before at the start of the episode, Cyril Hector Octave Côté. God, people had long names at the time. They formed this group in November of 1838. And basically it allowed them to foment plans at invading Canada or going back into Canada while also not being super public about it. And that's an important thing to note, I think, because as we saw actually with episodes 19 and 20 a bit, the US and Britain were relatively on good terms and the US had no problem with arresting people at the border, right? And we kind of mentioned it today. The official US policy was not in favor of this rebellion because they were trying to make reparations with Britain and to be on good economic and political terms with them.
Oh, I find it interesting that because originally the Sons of Liberty, the original one, said, we're not going to make a secret society. We're not going to be a private group. We're going to do this publicly. And now, oh, never mind.
The difference is, of course, now I think we have to look at it from a certain perspective because they were saying that from Lower Canada before everything exploded, right?
Oh,
they
for
wanted
sure.
to get people on their side, rightfully
For
so.
sure.
And so when you suddenly had to do it from the US, where you wouldn't necessarily have 100% support or a big part of the population support you, I understand that a bit more. Now, I'd have to check exactly. I didn't really find any information on who exactly could join, if there were that many limitations, right? It was secret in as much as you had to know someone who was part of it.
Right.
I don't know how many people were stopped. And I don't know how many limitations there were actually to you joining up. And accounts vary for the numbers, but depending on if it's French sources or English sources that you're listening to, but there's anywhere between 600 and 2,000 men that join up with this crew.
Whoop, whoop.
Obviously, the French side will be a bit downplayed just to bring attention to the fact that, hey, we're a small band that really are sticking it to the big guy. And probably the British side is more like, hey, no, there were a lot of people and we really were justified in bringing them down because, look, there were like 2,000 of them.
Propaganda. Woohoo!
But again, I'd have to check on this just to make sure. But if I remember correctly, that's pretty much what it was. And this is where I think it gets really interesting because this little or quite big group, depending on who you ask, actually got pretty far into a second invasion attempt into Canada. Right? They almost got from the States, from like Vermont up until Montreal, right? They took up a big part of what is now the townships in southern Quebec. They went through basically from the beginning of November and for about a week and a half, just plowed through the eastern townships up until Montreal. And it was actually quite noted. It's like, yeah, okay, we're really taking these small towns. It's great. We're gathering, more and more people up and more weapons as we go along and going up to Montreal. But ultimately, the British would stop them in Montreal. Right?
Yeah, and it would all fall apart. Robert Nelson wasn't Papineau. He couldn't keep his people together the same way Papineau could.
Exactly. Apparently, he wasn't a very charismatic leader, and he lacked military capabilities that really helped him in strategies beyond small towns.
Hmm.
And from there, the rebellion, as you say, kind of dies down. It's never quite the same again. If there are any uprisings, they're so minimal that it's not even worth mentioning. And for all intents and purposes, this is really where it ends. Right? At the end of 1838, the fringe movements themselves are pretty much over.
Hmm.
Now, again, both Wilfrid and Robert would be exiled from Canada. Wilfrid would actually go to Bermuda.
So not a total downgrade.
Not a total downgrade, but it was still a British colony at the time.
Yeah,
And so
I
he
know.
was still under British. Is it still now? Yes, that's right. It's part of the Commonwealth.
Yep. Yep.
Of course.
I lived there. I lived there.
That's right. Yeah, so he would go there under British supervision, and he would actually be able to return in 1842. By then, Lower Canada was called Canada East.
Hmm.
And he would actually have a relatively successful career as the first publicly elected mayor of Montreal eventually.
Which is good because the Nelson brothers had those progressive reforms that they wanted to put in their declaration.
And what's interesting is that once they come back, or at least once Wilfrid comes back, because Robert stays in the US and practices medicine for the rest of his life, he never comes back to Canada. What's interesting is that Wilfrid does kind of take the middle ground here once he comes back.
Mm-hmm.
He does simmer down, and even once he's elected to a public office, against a Papineauist, by the way, against what is officially a moderate, Wilfrid would still, for all intents and purposes, be someone who did not show these radical ideas and never, as mayor of Montreal, called for arms against the British. So, you had things under him like you had the installation of parks, attempts at welfare, public services, all kinds of things like that. So that pretty much puts an end to the main narrative, right? Again, we were kind of, the literature here was a bit more official.
Documented.
Documents.
Yeah.
Right. Reports and declarations, which I would argue are a part of literature.
Oh, yeah. They inform how things are written, how things are read.
But I do want to mention also that there is some poetry, what is considered, I guess, more conventional literature, if you will, rather than a declaration. There is some poetry that does kind of come out of this, and I wanted to just touch upon it a bit because that's the nature of the show.
Go ahead.
I'll touch upon one poem that was written the year after, in 1839, and it's called Aux exilés politiques canadiens, which is to the Canadian political exiles, by a man called Joseph Guillaume Barthes. And it's an interesting poem, I think, because it's one of the rare ones that I've seen, or at least that I found. And again, please send some to me if I missed it, that specifically mentions these more radical or fringe groups. Right in the first stanza, where he refers to his co-citizens and that they're fighting for sacred soil of our nation, he does also mention people like Nelson and also Desrivières, Vigée, Masson, who are all more active in their ability to promote change, and were definitely some of the more vocal minorities. And during this whole thing, and again, this is just a year after the rebellion is pretty much put down, he is very open about them fighting tyrants who pale in fright, basically, against this uprising. And it's quite nationalistic. It's quite romantic, if you will. I think it's quite indicative also of the staying power of these fringe movements, that they kind of were integrated into the main narrative at the time. And I say at the time because I don't think today we know much about them. Personally, I didn't learn much about the radical movements.
I never learned anything about the radical arts.
Right. But someone like Joseph Guillaume Barthes refers to them very directly here in his poem as martyrs and saints and people who were basically lifting up the cause of the Patriotes, or eventually their own Sons of Liberty and Hunter Brother movements.
Right.
So I thought that was a very interesting thing to point to. That being said, just as a conclusion, do you think there's an importance to learning this side of the story, right? Is it more indicative, you think, to just listen to the episodes 19 and 20, that side of the history, because it is kind of a generalized thing and you kind of get it? Or do you think that hearing this side of the story really changed or gave you a really fresh perspective on the rebellion?
I don't know if it gave me a fresh perspective, but it brought a deeper perspective. I wouldn't say this is a necessity for people to learn, but when you do learn it, it really does play to the intricacies of what was going on at the time and what was going on for these people. So I don't know if it really brought something completely new, but it's definitely enriched your knowledge, understanding what was going on with the radical parts of the rebellion, what was really going on with the Canadians, with the Nelson brothers, and how they operated, their declaration. Again, like that just brings so much foundation to what values we have in Canada and how long they've been our values.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. What I would add to that, though, is that I do find it interesting that basically what we were talking about today, this rebellion on the margins, if you will, was pretty much what the British were reacting to.
Yeah.
The British were acting as if this was the main narrative, or at least it was their main narrative. Right? Whereas for us today, it's mostly the Mackenzie and Papineau resistance. They're the central figures. Even from the very start, before Papineau ostensibly lost control of his own movement, the British were reacting as if all of this was the whole movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that's a very interesting way to understand history and understand where people place themselves in that moment.
For sure.
And yeah, I think that's pretty much most of what I got out of this.
I can agree with that.
All right. Is there anything that you want to end with? Are there any concluding thoughts that you have about this? Or can we pretty much end it for today?
I think we can end it. We can end our little mini-series on the Canadian rebellions of 1837, 1838.
But is it really over?
No.
No, it's not. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? We have a kind of epilogue, I guess.
We have the next stage of evolution.
So
we have the Durham Report.
Dun, dun, dun! For people who didn't see it, because this is not a visual medium, Mackenzie I think he lost a part of his soul right here.
I gave up just a little bit.
Yeah, but so we're not talking officially about the rebellions next episode, but we are talking pretty much about its aftermath with what is one of the most, I think, important reports in Canadian history.
Oh, yeah.
It's quite literally going to change everything.
It causes so many problems that we're still trying to deal with today because it is just...
Yeah.
We'll have a discussion.
It's a shit show, and I think it ties in directly into what I was saying about the British misunderstanding completely the situation and seeing what they want to see.
They just failed so hard with the Durham Report.
It's a classic example also of failing upward.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, we'll get into that in 2 weeks' time. But with that being said, I think that's it for this episode. I want to obviously thank everyone for listening. Yeah. As we mentioned at the top, you can reach out with any questions, comments, anything you want, concerns,
criticisms, scathing takedowns of our looks.
Go ahead. Yeah. Destroy us. Honestly, I love it. But no, you can reach out through Facebook, Twitter, by email, all that good stuff. You know where to find us. Anyway, all links are in the description. You can always support the show monetarily if you want, either some extra episodes and extra content on Patreon that we're going to be working on soon.
I'm going to be leading the show. It's going to be a wild ride.
If you want to hear more of Mackenzie, listen in to the Patreon because you're going to hear more of his smooth and sultry voice.
We talk about comedy in Canada. It's going to be a wild ride.
That's right. It's a bit of a sizzle reel of a show called Pop Canada that we're working on about pop culture in Canada, which is a huge element of Canadian cultural history, I think. Mm-hmm. You can also always check out the affiliate links for the recommended reading page that I have set up. I think there's some really good stuff in there. So if you're thinking of buying a book related to Canada and what we talk about, you can check it out through there and it gives us some kickback. Obviously, this is all optional. The main show will remain free and independent no matter what. Right? Mm-hmm. So you're still going to get our beautiful voices every 2 weeks. And finally, leaving a review always helps on iTunes. It really gets the show to more people's ears. And
even a bad review can be good.
Honestly, yeah, just to show that people are engaging with it. I'm
And it
down
also
for
makes
that.
for good meme material. I don't
If
know
we
what
get
kind
enough
of
bad reviews, we'll start a segment of the show just called like bad reviews. Where we
why we suck.
I love that. Suck it, Historia Canadiana.
Yeah, I don't know what kind of memes we're gonna be making on Canadian history and literature, but let's do it.
Okay. That'll be a side project. That'll be a Patreon side project. Making memes,
Reviewing memes.
reviewing Canadian memes. Anyway, this has gotten completely off topic and stupid, so I'm gonna end it here. We'll see you guys next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.
I hate you.